The envelope appeared at the railing just before 9 o'clock in the morning, and Jared Garcia saw it from 22 feet away without breaking stride. It sat at the base of the low marble border that separated the public walkway from the mat, pressed against the stone as though it had been placed with care, as though whoever left it had taken a moment to make sure it would not slide or tip. The envelope was plain white, standard letter size, and the name written on the front was not a name at all. It was a phrase in careful block letters that Jared could not read from where he stood, but that the people nearest to the railing could, and he noticed them lean in, one by one, reading it, and then straighten without speaking. He walked his 21 steps to the north end of the mat and stopped. 3 seconds. He turned on his right heel, brought his left foot alongside, and started back, 21 steps south. The crowd that had gathered along the plaza was thick for 9 in the morning. Memorial Day always brought them early. He had been on post since 7, and even then there had been families setting up along the wall, veterans in caps and jackets, a school group from somewhere in Northern Virginia arranged in a loose rectangle by a teacher in a yellow lanyard. Now the crowd had deepened. It pressed against the rope line 3 and 4 people back, and the air carried that particular Memorial Day quiet. The kind that was not silence exactly, but a collective agreement to keep voices low. A shared understanding that the ground they were standing on had a different weight than ordinary ground. Jared walked his 21 steps north and stopped. 3 seconds. Turned. The envelope was still there. Of course it was still there. Now, that was not his concern. What mattered was the mat, the post, the cadence, and the 21 steps. 21 steps for the 21-gun salute. 21 seconds between the steps and the turn. 21 counts of attention. The ritual was not ceremonial decoration. It was a clock, a vow renewed every 63 seconds, the arithmetic of remembrance worked out not in prayers or speeches, but in the precise geometry of a soldier's body on white marble. He walked south again. The crowd's attention had been divided since the envelope appeared. He could feel it without looking. There is a quality to the attention of a crowd that changes when something unexpected enters the frame. It does not become louder. It becomes thinner, stretched between 2 points. Half of them watched him. The other half watched the envelope. 3 seconds at the south end. Turn. North. What was written on the front of the envelope he did not yet know. He would learn it later from Ray Tyndall, who would find it during the post-interval and bring it to Sergeant First Class Okafor at the guardhouse. What Jared could see was that it had been addressed to someone, and that the someone was not a person whose name anyone could write down, and that was the reason the nearest visitors had leaned in and then stood back in something that looked a great deal like discomfort. He reached the north end. 3 seconds. Turned. Walked south. The school group near the back of the crowd had a boy who kept whispering to the girl next to him. The teacher in the yellow lanyard touched his shoulder once without looking at him, and he stopped. A man in a VFW cap 3 rows from the front was watching the envelope with an expression that Jared could not characterize precisely from his peripheral vision, but that registered somewhere between recognition and grief. 2 women stood together near the center of the rope line. Both wore small gold pins at their lapels. One had her hand at her mouth. The other looked straight ahead at the mat. Jared completed the next rotation without variation. If you have ever visited this plaza and wondered what a sentinel's field of awareness actually holds while he walks, consider leaving a comment below. The men on this post are reading everything in that crowd, even when nothing in their face or pace suggests it. Now, back to the watch. The uniform he wore had taken nearly 4 hours to prepare that morning. It always did on Memorial Day. There were sentinels who spent 3 hours in the prep room, and there were sentinels who spent 5, and the difference was not vanity. The difference was understanding what the uniform said and being willing to say it correctly. His shoes had been bowled to a mirror finish using a canteen of hot water, a cotton ball, and a tin of kiwi polish worked in circles no wider than a thumbnail until the leather stopped looking like leather and started looking like something a man could see himself in. The brass on his belt plate and his buttons had been polished to the same standard. The crease on his trousers was sharp enough to cast a thin shadow on a flat surface. His white cotton gloves had been bleached the night before and inspected in the morning light at the window. The helmet liner was lacquered black and worn at a specific angle, measured in fractions of inches. The chrome of the M14 rifle at his shoulder picked up the May light coming off the marble and threw it back in a clean line. The uniform was not costuming. It was a moral statement. It said that the man wearing it had decided, at the level of every cloth fiber and polished surface, that the people he guarded deserved the best of whatever he could provide. Not the adequate, not the presentable, the best. He walked his 21 steps and returned. Behind the rope line, the conversation about the envelope had begun to move through the crowd in low murmurs, the way rumors always move in still air, beginning at the railing and working outward. Jared heard a fragment when he passed nearest the south end, a woman's voice saying, "It's addressed to the unknown soldiers, not one of them, all of them." Her voice was not unkind. It was uncertain, the way people sound when they are confronted with an act they cannot quite categorize. The man next to her said something Jared did not catch. The woman said, "Well, somebody put it there, so somebody must have meant it." Another voice, slightly farther back, a younger voice, said, "Who leaves a letter with no name on it? What's the point? Nobody's going to read it. They're just going to throw it away." The VFW man, 2 rows from the front, did not turn to look at whoever had said that. He adjusted the brim of his cap and kept his eyes on the mat. Jared reached the north end. 3 seconds. Turned. His eyes passed across the crowd on the return and found the 2 women with the gold pins still standing together. One of them was watching the envelope now. The young voice in the back had spoken the thing that a portion of the crowd was feeling without knowing they felt it. The low-grade assumption that an unaddressed act is an ineffective one, that leaving a letter for a recipient who carries no name means the letter goes nowhere and amounts to nothing. The voice had said it plainly enough that several people around it had shifted their feet. Nobody had said anything in response. That was the first time the phrase was used publicly, that careless reduction of what the envelope meant, and it had landed in the crowd the way a pebble lands in still water, not destroying anything, but disturbing the surface for anyone paying attention. Jared walked south. He did not alter his pace by a fraction of a second. What occupied the interior of that pace, under the perfect stillness of the surface, was a specific and practiced form of attention. He held the crowd's composition in his awareness the way a man holds a complex map in his head, not by staring at all of it at once, but by knowing where each element is without looking. The school group near the back, the VFW man 3 rows from the front, the 2 women with the gold pins, a family with a young child on the father's shoulders near the east corner, a woman he had noticed when he first came on post, standing alone, somewhat to the right of center, who had arrived early and had not moved from her position in the time he had been walking. She was older, 70s perhaps, small in the way of a person who had once been taller and had settled. She wore a good coat despite the warmth of the morning, dark blue, and she stood with her hands folded at her waist with a specific quality of stillness that Jared recognized from long practice. She was not the stillness of a person who was bored or waiting or uncomfortable. She was the stillness of a person who had come to do something, had done it, and was now remaining to see it through. He noted her. He did not know yet that she was the one who had left the envelope. He reached the south end. 3 seconds. Turned. 3 seconds was the regulation. The pause at each end of the mat. He had been asked once by a reporter if the 3 seconds felt long or short, and he had thought about it for longer than the reporter probably expected before saying that it felt exactly right. The reporter had written that down, and Jared had later read the piece and thought that the word right was the one true thing in it. 3 seconds was not long enough to seem a hesitation, and not short enough to seem a dismissal. It was the precise duration of acknowledgement. Hear, then turn, and begin again. He walked north. Behind him, the low conversation about the envelope had continued to move. He heard a new fragment. Someone explaining to someone else that objects left at the tomb were handled by relief personnel and cemetery staff, not by the active sentinel. Someone else saying that it seemed disrespectful to leave things like that it was cluttering up the space. The younger voice in the back agreeing, saying it was probably some kind of stunt, something for social media. The first time the dismissal had come from someone's careless question. The second time, it came from the young voice in the back, attaching a motive to the act itself, projecting the familiar grammar of attention-seeking onto something that had no camera aimed at it, no name affixed, no account to credit. Jared completed his rotation. At the guardhouse, out of sight behind the amphitheater wall, Ray Tyndall was finishing the preparation for the relief. Jared would learn later, in the brief words that passed between them at the post-interval, that Ray had seen the envelope on his approach and had hesitated before picking it up, standing over it for a moment the way you stand over something you are not sure you should touch. Then he had taken it to Sergeant Okafor, who had turned it over in his hands, read the address on the front, and looked at Ray for a long moment. The address on the front read, "To every unknown soldier, all of you." Okafor had said, "Let's see what this is." And Ray had told him later that his voice when he said it was the same voice he used for everything, the voice that carried no particular weather, the voice of a man who would read the letter and decide its weight before he decided anything else. The crowd along the plaza had no way of knowing any of this. What they knew was that the envelope sat at the railing, and that the sentinel walked his 21 steps without acknowledging it, and that neither of those facts resolved the question of what the envelope was or what would happen to it. Jared walked south. The early May light on the plaza was the particular quality of mid-morning in Virginia, when the sun has cleared the tree line but not reached the zenith, and everything it touches picks up a pale gold cast. The marble of the tomb held that light without reflecting it. The stone took it in and gave back something quieter. The inscription on the front face read the same words it had always read: "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." He had read those words during his first walk-through as a candidate for the Guard 3 years ago. He had read them again every day since. They had not worn smooth from repetition. They sharpened each time, the way a blade sharpens with use rather than dulling, because the thing they were cutting was not stone or paper, but the ordinary tendency of the mind to forget that the weight of the past is always present, carried in every step taken on the ground above it. 3 seconds at the north end. Turn. He reached into the interior of that knowledge only briefly, in the way he allowed himself to reach only briefly, because the post required the surface and the interior served the surface, and the arrangement between the two was not coldness but management. What could not be managed could not be endured. What could not be endured could not be sustained, and the guard required sustaining. Day after day, rotation after rotation, the 21 steps and the 3 seconds and the turn. Marcus Webb had understood that, in the particular way he understood things, which was directly and without abstraction. Marcus had been the kind of man who said the plain thing without apology, and whose plain things turned out almost always to be the true things. He had served with Jared in the 101st 3rd Deployment, Kandahar Province. He had been 24 years old. He had been good at cards and terrible at keeping a bunk inspection ready, and very, very good at the things that mattered in the field. He had died on September 14th, 2011, in a manner that the after-action report described with the economy of military language, and his body had not been recovered for 11 days after the engagement because of the nature of the ground and the conditions. 11 days. Jared had counted them in the specific way you count days when you are waiting for something to be returned to you, a number that did not lose its shape with time. The photograph was in his breast pocket, as it was at every post, 4 inches by 3, laminated, the edges worn at the corners where it had been handled. It showed Marcus at a forward operating base, squinting into the sun, holding a can of something that was not coffee, grinning with the specific grin of a man who knew the photograph was being taken and did not care. Jared carried it because Marcus had no name above a tomb, and because carrying it was the one private thing he was permitted inside the public performance of the post. The uniform was the public statement. The photograph was the reason the statement was not hollow. He completed the rotation. South End. 3 seconds. Turn. The crowd had shifted in its composition over the past hour. New visitors had arrived, and some of the earliest had moved further along the cemetery grounds. The school group from Virginia was still present, the teacher in the yellow lanyard keeping them reasonably contained near the back of the crowd. The 2 women with the gold pins had moved slightly forward. The VFW man in the front row had been joined by 3 others wearing similar caps, and they stood in a loose line with a quality of attention that Jared recognized as the particular alertness of men who have stood at attention themselves and who watch men on post with the specific respect of people who know what it costs. The woman in the dark blue coat had not moved. Sergeant Okafor appeared from the colonnade side of the plaza at 10:47. Jared noted the arrival without turning his head. Okafor moved with the unhurried quality of a man, with authority sufficient that he did not need to advertise it. He was 51 years old, and he had the bearing of a man who had been correcting errors and maintaining standards for so long that neither act required effort anymore. He held the white envelope at his side. He stopped near the rope line, not at it, but near enough that the visitors in the front several rows could see the envelope in his hand and understand that something was about to be addressed. Okafor did not look at the crowd first. He looked at the tomb. He stood that way for a moment. Then he turned, and his voice when he spoke was measured and clear, not loud but carrying, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in outdoor spaces at ceremonies where quieter voices would be swallowed by wind and grief. He said that an envelope had been found at the railing that morning, left by a visitor to the memorial, addressed to the soldiers interred here and to the soldiers they represent. He said that before the letter was properly handled and preserved, he wanted to read one line of it to the assembled visitors, because he believed those visitors had come to this place on this morning with the same intention as the person who had written it. A few people along the rope line had looked at one another. The young voice in the back had said nothing. Okafor opened the envelope. He unfolded the letter, which was a single handwritten page, and he read for a moment without speaking. the way a person reads before reading aloud, checking the weight of what they are about to release into a space where it cannot be taken back. Then he read one line. He said, "I am writing because my son came home from the war and could not say the names of the men who did not, and I have carried those unnamed men in me for 20 years, and I am sorry it took me this long to say it to your faces." He folded the letter. The plaza was quiet. Not the earlier quiet of the Memorial Day crowd, which had been in agreement to keep voices low. This was different. This was the quiet of a place where something had been named accurately for the first time, and the naming had taken all the available air. The VFW man in the front row removed his cap. The other 3 men beside him removed their caps. The 2 women with the gold pins stood very still. Near the back, the school group had gone fully silent. One of the children, a girl near the center, had her hand against her chest. The young voice in the back said nothing. Okafor did not move immediately. He stood holding the folded letter and let the quiet settle, the way you let something settle that has been waiting a long time to be still. Then someone in the crowd said, softly but clearly, a woman's voice toward the right side of the gathering, "I think that's her." People near her turned. The woman in the dark blue coat stood where she had stood all morning, hands folded at her waist, in the particular stillness of a person who had done what she came to do, and who was not seeking acknowledgement, and who had, perhaps, not expected to be identified. She was 72 years old, and she had the face of a woman who had thought about this letter for a long time before she wrote it. Her expression was not one of satisfaction. It was not relief exactly. It was the expression of a person who has finally said a thing they have been carrying, and is now simply standing in the aftermath of having said it, which is a kind of quiet that is not like any other quiet. Several people near her stepped back slightly, not from her, but for her, making a small space around her that was also a kind of acknowledgement. One of the women with the gold pins took a step toward her and then stopped, as though she recognized that the space around Eleanor needed to be honored rather than filled. The teacher in the yellow lanyard had a hand over her mouth. Jared was at the south end of the mat. 3 seconds. He turned. He had heard the line Okafor read. He heard it the way you hear something that lands in the center of a space you have long kept cleared, because it names the precise thing without decoration. 20 years. She had carried them. Her son had come home unable to speak the names. She had written the letter because he could not. 11 days. Marcus Webb had been unrecovered for 11 days, and in those 11 days Jared had thought repeatedly about what it meant that a man could be lost in a way that left no specific place to stand over, no ground to mark, no name in stone. The tomb was not a solution to that. It was not a resolution. It was a witness. It said, "We know they are here even when we cannot say where, and we will stand at this place and count the steps and mark the seconds, because the counting and the marking are the only honest answer to the fact of their absence." The woman in the dark blue coat had understood that. She had understood it from a different direction, through her son's silence, through 20 years of carrying men whose names her son could not say. And she had come to this plaza on Memorial Day morning and left a letter at the railing addressed not to a name, but to all of them. Jared walked his 21 steps north. He reached the north end of the mat. 3 seconds. He turned. He stopped. It was a fractional deviation, a half rotation to the left that put him facing the plaza rather than the south end of the mat. And he held that position for a single measured beat, facing out toward the crowd, toward the place where Eleanor stood in her dark blue coat, with her hands folded and her face carrying the quiet of a person who had finally said the thing. He raised his right hand, white cotton glove sharp against the chrome and the morning light. A formal salute, precise at the brim of the helmet liner. He held it for 3 seconds. The crowd understood immediately the way crowds understand things that do not require explanation, because the body already knows the meaning. The VFW men in the front row straightened. Several others came to attention without being asked to. The automatic posture of people whose bodies remember what the gesture means. Eleanor raised her chin slightly. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried in public, or perhaps she had already cried privately over the writing of the letter, and what remained was only the resolution of a long-held position, finally released. She gave a small, deliberate nod, the nod of a person returning a recognition, with everything they had left. Jared lowered his hand. He turned south and resumed his walk. 21 steps, returning. The crowd's quiet held for another full rotation. Nobody spoke. The only sound on the plaza was the cadence of his footsteps on the white stone, measured and regular, the same cadence that had continued through everything that morning, through the letter's arrival and the crowd's uncertainty, and the younger voice's dismissal, and Okafor's reading, and the silence and the salute. The cadence had not varied. It did not vary now. It was the answer to everything. The only answer the post permitted, the one that had to be renewed every 63 seconds, regardless of what the world outside the mat was doing. He walked north. Okafor spoke to the crowd again, briefly. He told them that the letter would be reviewed by cemetery staff according to established procedure, and that based on its nature and the date of its receipt, he had recommended it be preserved in the tomb's historical record, alongside the other acts of remembrance left at this memorial over its history. He said it in the same measured voice, without ceremony of tone, the way a man states the correct disposition of something he believes deserves correct treatment. Nobody argued. The young voice in the back was not heard again. The school group began gradually to reassemble around the teacher in the yellow lanyard, who had recovered herself and who was speaking to them in a low voice with the expression of a teacher who had just watched her students receive an education that no classroom could have planned. The boy who had been whispering was quiet now and looking at the mat with a specific quality of attention that was different from the attention of a person who was merely watching. He was the kind of young, attentive attention of a person who is trying to remember something. The woman with the gold pin had moved close enough to Eleanor to touch her arm lightly once. Eleanor had looked at her, and something had passed between them in the way things pass between people who share a specific grief that most of the world around them does not carry in the same form. No words were audible from where Jared walked. None were necessary. He completed his rotations. North end, south end, the mat, the mat, the mat, the white marble holding the May light, the inscription facing the plaza, the people slowly beginning to move again, dispersing through the cemetery grounds in the gradual way of Memorial Day crowds who have been somewhere they needed to be and are now carrying it with them to the next place. The VFW men were the last to move from the front row. They lingered until Jared had completed 3 more full rotations, watching him walk with the attentiveness of former soldiers, watching a post manned correctly, which was also a form of salute, quiet and unspoken and entirely clear. Eleanor had gone by then. She had moved through the crowd with the same quality she had arrived with, unhurried, without calling attention to herself. A woman who had come to do a specific thing, and who had done it, and who required nothing further from the day except the knowledge that it was done. Jared had noted her departure on the second rotation after the salute. Dark blue coat, hands at her sides now instead of folded at her waist. Moving east through the dispersing crowd, past the families with children, past the last of the veterans, toward the long path that ran along the cemetery's upper ground. He did not watch her go. The post did not allow it, and the occasion did not require it. She had done what she came to do. He had done what the post permitted him to do. The exchange was complete, and clean and entirely within bounds, and returning his full attention to the mat was not a dismissal of what had occurred. It was the continuation of what had occurred. The 21 steps were the reason the letter had a place to be left. They were the reason the morning mattered. They were the reason any of them were standing on this hill at all. Ray Tyndall arrived for the relief at 1100 hours. His uniform was correct in every particular. He walked from the guardhouse in the measured pace of a man approaching a post he treats as a serious inheritance, which is the only way he had ever approached it. They exchanged the rifle and the position in the formal sequence of the relief ceremony, the movements precise and practiced in carrying their own specific weight. And Jared came off the mat, knowing that the mat continued, that the 21 steps went on without him and would go on after him, and that this was not a loss, but the architecture of the thing. He had been asked once, in a leadership course, what the tomb meant to him personally. He had given the answer he could give in that setting, about tradition and honor and the regiment's standards. He had not given the other answer, which was that the tomb was the one place where the absence of a name was not a failure, but a statement. The inscription said, "Known but to God," because there were men who could not be recovered and named, and the tomb did not pretend otherwise. It stood at the site of the not knowing and held the ground. Marcus had known exactly who he was and had been known by the people who served with him. He had a name and a service record, and a family in Greensboro, North Carolina, who had received a flag. But 11 days was 11 days, and the not knowing of those 11 days lived in Jared the same way it lived in every family who had ever waited. And the tomb was for them, too. The photograph in his breast pocket was 4 inches by 3, laminated, edges worn at the corners. If you stood at this memorial yourself, or if someone you knew stood this post, we'd be glad to hear from you below. Those stories deserve to be told. The afternoon continued at Arlington. Other ceremonies proceeded further along the grounds. A wreath was laid at noon by a delegation whose motorcade had arrived through the Sheridan Gate. Children left small flags they had been given at the entrance kiosk, pressing them into the grass along the paths with the focused care of young children given a specific and important task. Veterans moved through the cemetery in small groups, stopping at specific stones, at familiar numbers etched in granite, finding the names they had come to find. On the plaza above the tomb, Jared stood in the relief position and watched Ray walk his 21 steps north with the chrome rifle correct at his shoulder, white gloves precise, helmet liner angled at the measured degree. The steps did not vary. The 3-second pause at the north end did not vary. The turn did not vary. The marble of the tomb held the afternoon light the same way it held the morning light, without reflecting it, taking it in and returning something quieter. The faint luminescence of stone that has stood through more weather than any one person alive can remember. The inscription faced the plaza. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier, known but to God. A sealed letter, handwritten on a single page, addressed to every unknown soldier, written by a woman whose son had come home carrying names he could never say, would pass that afternoon through the proper channels to the cemetery's archival staff. It would be designated a memorial document. It would be stored correctly and with care. Okafor had recommended it, and his recommendation was not a bureaucratic reflex, but the considered judgment of a man who knew the difference between what belonged to procedure and what belonged to history. None of that was what Jared thought about, standing in the relief position while Ray walked the mat. He thought about 11 days. He thought about the weight of a 4x3 photograph laminated against a breast pocket, worn at the corners from handling, and about a woman in a dark blue coat who had folded her hands at her waist and stood for 3 hours on a Tuesday morning in May because she had something to say, and she had finally come to say it. He thought about her son, who had come home. He thought about the men who had not. Ray reached the south end of the mat. 3 seconds. Turned. Began walking north. 21 steps. The chrome of the rifle catching the afternoon light and throwing it back in a clean line, the white of the gloves holding their brightness against the stone. In Jared's breast pocket, Marcus Webb was still grinning into the sun. The steps went on.